Welcome to a special crossover episode of Locked On Wild and Locked On Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Sports Podcast Network, your teams every day. Thank you for making both Locked On Wild and Locked On Blackhawks your first listen each and every day. Just a reminder, both shows are free and available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline.net. BetOnline.net has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. You can find all of it at BetOnline, where the game starts. On today's crossover episode, we take a look at how things have gone for both the Wild and the Blackhawks with an off-season check-in. We are going to be taking a look at some of the big moves, big trades, both teams making some trades. We'll see where things are at as we move through. My name is Seth Toupal, the fearless leader of Locked On Wild, veteran Minnesota sports content producer with well over a decade's worth of experience covering your favorite Minnesota sports teams, now guiding you through the offseason here on Locked On Wild, joined by the host of Locked On Blackhawks, Jack Bushman. Jack, it is offseason time, and it's been a minute since we've had a chance to check in on how our teams have been doing. A busy offseason for Chicago, so why don't we start right there? A lot of trades, a lot of moves with a couple of veteran players still in the mix that may not be as the season moves on. So let's just start with, what was the trade that shocked you the most by Chicago this offseason?
Yeah, it's been a chaotic past few months. It slowed down a little bit as we're now in August here, Seth. But yeah, I was just thinking about this the other day. I was just thinking about how new everything is for the Blackhawks, right? New head coach, Luke Richardson, even though Kyle Davidson was here in the second half of last season, new general manager, a heck of a whole lot of new players, new mentality behind the organization. It's crazy right now. But to answer your question, I think the trade that's going to come to every Blackhawks fan's mind when you talk about this offseason is Alex DeBrincat. Not the trade in alone of itself, because we really shouldn't have been too surprised by that the weeks leading up to when that deal happened, the first day of the NHL draft. There were a lot of rumors that Alex DeBrincat was more than likely going to get moved. It seemed like a matter of when and not if at that point, but the trade in itself wasn't shocking. I would say the return for what we got for Alex DeBrincat was a little bit underwhelming. A lot of people were thinking the Blackhawks were going to get multiple first-round picks. They only end up getting one here, a high second-round pick as well. They added to their prospect pool by getting Kevin Korchinski with the 7th overall selection, but I think everyone was a little underwhelmed at what Alex DeBrincat was able to net. Now, he didn't go and sign an extension with the Ottawa Senators, and that's something that potentially could have cost the Blackhawks a little bit. I feel like if he had reached an agreement with Ottawa for multiple years moving forward, the Blackhawks could have commanded more, but they weren't able to get a whole lot, man. Only one first-round pick here. It really stung at the end of the day to give away a 24-year-old, two-time 40-goal scorer for that type of return. And also, Ottawa, they've been building up prospects for years and years and years. They have one of the deepest prospect pools in the entire NHL, and not to nab a single player from that pool to get in return for Alex DeBrincat, I mean, I was just absolutely stunned, man, and a little bit heartbroken that, I knew DeBrincat was probably going to go, but that type of return added insult to injury a little bit. So, yeah, that's the one that I think is going to sting for the Blackhawks, and kind of the one move I think so far that Kyle Davidson, rightfully so, deserves critique for, because everyone across the league was saying what a steal Ottawa got for getting Alex DeBrincat, who we know is one of the elite goal scorers in the NHL already at such a young age, Seth.
It's fascinating because you look at the anatomy of that trade, you look at the anatomy of the Kevin Fiala trade, and it almost seems like what Chicago was hoping for happened with what the Wild were able to do with trading Kevin Fiala to the Kings. They got some more back in return because Fiala signed the long-term extension to stay with the Kings, got a prospect back in return, and it just goes to show you, and I think this is, the quote that Bill Guerin had after the Fiala trade is, look, we thought this was a fair deal and we didn't want to wait for things to maybe you have the chance that a deal gets sweetened the later you wait, but you maybe also have the chance that you end up having less teams interested and therefore a lower return in return.
Yeah, that's kind of the scenario I think the Blackhawks found themselves in. It would have done a whole lot, would have done their front office a favor had Alex DeBrincat been willing to sign that extension. I don't know if that was even talked about or whatnot, but it definitely seemed to hinder the value a little bit. And yeah, man, it's going to be crazy to look at the Blackhawks next year. It's going to be a whole completely different team. And for better or worse, we're going to find out in years to come. But it's definitely not been an easy offseason for us fans, knowing what the product on the ice is probably going to look like here in a month or two.
And it's a two-pronged approach. You've got what you're building towards, but you also have a couple of long-time franchise mainstays who are kind of in limbo right now. Patrick Kane, Jonathan Toews, do they stick with the team? Do they end up being traded to a contender at the deadline or before? What's your feeling on that? Do you think they end up sticking around longer, or is the writing on the wall that those two guys will be wearing a different uniform before the season is over?
Yeah, that seems to be the question that everyone's asking me when we're doing crossovers right now is what's the status on Patrick Kane and Jonathan Toews? What's happening there? The latest we know is it seems like the trade deadline is going to be the most likely scenario for them to get dealt. Just feels a little bit unrealistic that either of them sign extensions at this point. First, for Patrick Kane, I feel like he's a little bit more likely to stay than Jonathan Toews is, given that there are some records that he can set, and it just feels like he's the more likely one of the two to stay. But at the same time, the Blackhawks front office really hasn't done him any favors over the years. I've talked about this on every show I've been on discussing this topic, but look at all the players that Patrick Kane has had success with that the Blackhawks have traded. It's literally been each and every one. It's like each youngster that comes up through the pipelines or they acquire, they put him on the line with Kaner. They're getting some chemistry, and then for whatever reason, it only ends up lasting a year or two. We saw it with Nick Schmaltz, Artemi Panarin, Alex DeBrincat. There's more that I'm leaving out of there too, but it's probably been very frustrating for Patrick Kane. And I wouldn't be surprised if Alex DeBrincat moving him was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will, because Kane just really enjoyed playing with DeBrincat. They always had a good time together. Kaner spoke in his end of the season press conference about how if DeBrincat was here long term, it would be easier to see him here long term. And they just really haven't done him any favors in that area. So I ultimately do think it's likely that both of them are gone come trade deadline time. It gives them a little bit more time to get their farewell tour, if you will, with the Blackhawks. Also, with the team probably not going to be very good next year, Seth, it's one reason to entice fans to come on down to the UC. I think moving them at the deadline makes the most sense personally. Jonathan Toews, I didn't touch on him at all, but I did want to say that he's just been reluctant to commit to the Blackhawks moving forward. He said time and time again when he's been asked about his future and what he wants to do, I don't want to. I can't get mad at the guy for speaking the honest truth and saying he honestly doesn't know what he wants to do, but hearing your 13, 14-year captain not commit to the team moving forward, it's never a good sign, right? So, yeah, for both of these guys, I think the most likely outcome is that they get traded at the deadline, Seth.
Okay. Well, it's obviously some changing landscapes in Chicago, and we'll discuss how that factors in to the rest of the division to end today's show. But I do want to give you the opportunity to flip it. Obviously, the Wild have had a few moves that they've made themselves, so we'll turn our attention to the Minnesota Wild's offseason as we continue today's special crossover episode of Locked On Wild and Locked On Blackhawks after this. Today's episode is brought to you by the fine folks at BetOnline.net. BetOnline.net has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. You can find any possible information you're looking for, whether it be news on your favorite team, whether it be podcasts, whether it be lines for games that you are going to be keeping an eye on. NFL is coming up here before you know it. Major League Baseball is in the thick of their season, and The NHL will be getting going here before too long as well. So plenty of information for you to digest as you get ready to start putting wagers down on your favorite sports teams. So head to betonline.net or pop onto your mobile phone to check out all of the latest info from your betting leaders. betonline.net, where the game starts. Continuing today's episode of Locked On Wild and Locked On Blackhawks, Seth Toupal joined by Jack Bushman. And Jack, let's flip it. Obviously, the Wild have had some moves that they've made, a flurry of roster moves, as it were. And so go ahead. Any questions you've got? I'm an open book for how things have gone in Minnesota.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a few questions that I want to ask you. First, something that came out just a few days ago, some of our listeners might have seen, but the Central Division rankings was posted by the Locked On NHL channel on Twitter. And the Wild, when I was listing the teams and ranking them, I really wasn't sure what to do with them, to be honest, because they have made a couple of moves, but I also feel like it was a fairly quiet offseason for them. And also something that you've talked about like each and every time that we've done the show is how limited they're going to be financially because of the buyouts of Zach Parise and Ryan Suter. Thank you. I apologize. But I just wanted to ask you overall, I mean, what is kind of your feeling on the Minnesota Wild's offseason? They moved Kevin Fiala. I want to save the Cam Talbot conversation, that just by itself. I want to get into that alone. But it feels like really like Kevin Fiala was trading, that was the major move that they made. And then a couple of splashes here and there. But for maybe, you know, the Blackhawks fans who aren't too up to date with the Wild, kind of fill us in on the moves that they did make and kind of your feeling on it all in all.
Well, obviously, the Kevin Fiala trade is the big one, as that has been, it seems, in the works for a while, or had been. Bill Guerin pretty vocal about the anticipated outcome there. So that was the big one. You had a couple of guys that the Wild acquired at the trade deadline that didn't end up sticking around, most notably Nick Delorier. Some re-signings, Jacob Middleton being the biggest one, helping kind of shore up that decor. The big theme, and obviously you have the Cam Talbot trade for Philip Gustafsson as well, but we'll discuss that in detail here in a bit. The big theme here for the Wild is that they are hoping that they get similar things to happen this season that they had last year. You had all these guys, Marcus Foligno, Ryan Hartman, Matt Zuccarello, Kevin Fiala, Kirill Kaprizov, who had career seasons and helped set the franchise record for goals scored in a season. More importantly, you had the emergence of Matt Boldy midway through the year to really give the Wild that second line scoring punch. The Wild are hoping that this year, Marco Rossi can continue a trend of Wild rookies who have come to the NHL level and have really impressed. You had Kirill Kaprizov winning the Calder Trophy. If Matt Boldy is healthy the entire season, I'm sorry, he's winning the Calder. I'm just going to go ahead and say that right now. And so you have those two guys. You now have Marco Rossi, who the Wild are hoping can continue that trend of rookies that can impress. You are hoping that we get a full season of Matt Boldy with solid production there. I think the biggest thing that the Wilds, and this may not be something that has been said, but in my feeling, the Wild are hoping for a bounce back in the special teams department, especially. That is one area that I think can really help this team. You lose an 85-point scorer in Kevin Fiala. And what are some ways that you can help get back some of that offense? It's power play goals. It's limiting opponents on special teams. The Wild special teams unit was terrible last year, and it really held them back. It came up again in the series against the St. Louis Blues. It was just they were giving up power play goals. They weren't scoring on the power play. You can't do that. So as much as they would like to fill that lack of production with the departure of Kevin Fiala, I feel like it's going to be more a situation where they try to limit the goals they score while trying to fill as much of that loss of offense as they can. But if they get a little better goaltending all season than they did at points, and if they improve the special teams unit, I think this Wild team, maybe not a franchise record-breaking season, but I think they can still be a good team. It's just they're going to have to commit to some of those other areas. Everybody loves the goals. Everybody loves seeing the goals scored. But the Wild are going to need to recommit to some of those key areas and probably dig into what they were in previous seasons, a little more of a gritty team to come away with some victories. I think it's certainly attainable, but it's going to be something that they're going to have to work at collectively.
So before we move on to my next question, I do want to ask you, where did you rank the Wild when you answered that poll, Seth? Where'd you have them?
I had them at 2.
Yeah, I felt like you would. I think I had them at 4, to be honest, but I had no idea what to do with them.
My reasoning, and we'll talk about this more to end the show as well, but my reasoning being that it just didn't seem like anybody else in the Central Division really did anything to separate themselves. I mean, I guess you could say Nashville by getting Ryan McDonough, and also
they're so weird.
Yeah, I can't trust them. But like St. Louis had some major losses, retained some players. Ville Husso is going to be one that's felt, especially if Jordan Binnington struggles. Dallas, Nashville, all those teams, it feels like they had losses. They had some signings, but just like the Wild, they had some losses as well. So it's a group that is just really lumped together for me. So 2 through 4, 2 through 5 could end up being really in any order you want it to be. And I feel like those teams are all pretty close.
Yeah, I can completely agree on that end. Moving on to my next question, two-parter, both about the goaltender position for the Minnesota Wild. Talk to me about what the heck happened with that Cam Talbot situation, because you'd know better than I would. I saw some things on Twitter. I saw the back and forth that was kind of had. What really happened there, and kind of what were your feelings on that? And then the second part is the Marc-Andre Fleury signing. How do you feel about that? Are you confident with him as the one going forward now that Cam Talbot's out of the picture? Talk to me about the whole goaltending scenario of the Minnesota Wild this upcoming season, because I think it is going to be very crucial for this team.
It is 100%, and I can give you the entire scope in a truncated way because of the amount of times that I've discussed this topic. So what happened was, obviously you had the goalie tandem down the stretch between Fleury and Talbot after Fleury was acquired at the deadline. People within that rotation were not super psyched to do it again. And so you have on the at the draft, you have Cam Talbot's agent voicing some displeasure about the fact that the Wild are going to go into a goalie tandem once again for this upcoming season. Trying to leverage, because the other part of this too is that Cam Talbot was the lesser paid of the two options. Not by much, but he still was the lesser paid of the two options. And so that was something that didn't sit well with the Talbot camp. Also having to do the 50-50 split. And the entirety of what happened in the postseason against the Blues obviously didn't sit well either. So you have all these factors that kind of come together, and then you have the exchange between Talbot's agent and Bill Guerin, who basically said, look, I don't have to do anything for you guys. If you're not happy with the situation that we have with this team, that's tough. We're going into the season with these two guys in net, and that you're just going to have to accept that is how things are going to play. Like, he wasn't going to be hardballed into trying to work out maybe some sort of a new deal for Talbot, give him a little more money, ensure that he was going to be the starter, any of that. He put his foot down and he said, I'm not going to do it. So then after that, Guerin kind of thought to himself, if Talbot doesn't want to be here, and he maybe isn't super thrilled with the situation, but not somebody that's like making waves or anything. Like, I think he would have gone into this season just fine. But Guerin was like, if he doesn't want to be here, let's accommodate that and let's send him somewhere else. So they send him to Ottawa. They get Philip Gustafson, a young goalie who was expected to be the goalie of the future in Ottawa. It obviously didn't work out that way. So Gustafson coming back, and you now have Fleury as the de facto starter. Gustafson is the backup. And basically, the Wild can go into the next couple of seasons essentially just trying to fill time until Jesper Wallstedt is ready. He's going to be in Iowa this year. If he dominates in Iowa, it's not going to shock me at all if he ends up getting the call and ends up being on the Wild roster a year from now. It all depends on when he is ready to go. And so you have Fleury, who signed to a 1-year deal plus an option, is what I'm calling the contract, because if he retires after this season, it doesn't hurt the Wild at all. So nice little add in there. So it's basically 1 year and an option. You have him, you have Gustafson. If Gustafson doesn't work out, he's a restricted free agent after the season, so you can figure out what to do with him there. If Fleury doesn't work out, he wants to retire after the end of the season, then you know, okay, we're going to need to go get somebody that can be our starter with limited funds. If Fleury comes back, okay, he's the starter. Maybe Wallstedt works his way into the backup. If Gustafson works out and Fleury works out, then you keep both, and there's less pressure on Wallstedt to have to like rapidly ascend to the NHL level. So it's really just trying to fill the pieces of the puzzle. And I don't think there's anybody more than Marc-Andre Fleury that realizes he's going to need to pick up his performance. I mean, he went 9-2 down the stretch with the Wild, but some of the underlying numbers, he got worked around a little bit by some of the more playoff caliber teams in a Minnesota uniform. There's nobody that is more critical of his own performance than Fleury. And I would imagine that he has worked with the team, is working with the team to get back to more of that form that we expect from him that we saw with Vegas. And so, if the Wild can get some of that too, that's going to go a long way for them to be able to get things back on track in the Central Division.
Yeah, I always had a feeling that Fleury was likely going to re-sign with Minnesota, and it sounds like with this option, as you've put it, that it puts the Wild in a good spot regardless, right? Like, we know Jesper Wallstedt just had an amazing World Junior. He's looking very promising. I'm still kind of surprised that he wasn't the first goaltender taken in last year's NHL draft. But Fleury, I mean, if you're going to have a placeholder waiting for pieces of the puzzle in later years to step onto the scene, that's, one heck of a guy to do it. And the playoffs, maybe he wasn't great, but you know that he's a guy that has that fire inside him and is always a true competitor. We even saw it with the Blackhawks when, he's getting 5 or 6 goals scored on him night in and night out. He's still getting just as upset. So, yeah, that's an interesting spot, but a good spot for the Wild's goaltender position to be in after kind of a wild offseason, if you will, wink, wink, for that position in particular. But to round things out, Seth, the only final question that I had for you was, are the Wild going to be better than they were last year? Can they make a run similar to what they had last year, but with more playoff success? Obviously, they were a first-round exit to St. Louis. What's the mood around the Wild heading into the season? And also, what would you say is the fan expectation like? Are they still high on this team despite the first round exit last year? Do they feel like they can do it again? What's the feeling around this hockey team up in Minnesota as we're just a month away from the season now, or the preseason at least?
I think there's a lot of disappointment with how things worked out with Kevin Fiala, and the feeling that the Wild have kind of boxed themselves in to, well, if we had done some things differently, Kevin Fiala would still be here. At the end of the day, it's Bill Guerin's team, and he's making the moves that he thinks are going to help this team out the most and are going to make them competitive, not only now, but the big goal being to be hitting that full window once the buyouts are done, 2 years after this season is done. So there is some disappointment from fans that things worked out the way that they did. But ultimately, I think a lot of that can be washed away if the team comes out and they just start racking up some wins. It's probably not going to be as flashy as it was last year. You're not going to have as many of those dominant wins that we saw from the team over the course of the season. You're going to see a lot more 3-2, 4-2 type games. But I'll circle back to, if the Wild buy in to the special teams and get some better defense and goaltending, I think they're going to be just fine. It probably won't be a franchise record for goals, all these players breaking the points mark, but they could still be a very dangerous team if they just shore things up collectively a little bit and just run back at it again, just like every other team in the Central, trying to run it back and dethrone the Colorado Avalanche. So it's going to be interesting, that is for sure. And there's a lot that could happen in the Central Division. So let's wrap up by taking a look at the Central, kind of where things are at this point. And we'll do that as we continue today's crossover episode of Locked On Wild and Locked On Blackhawks after this. You're hanging out with some friends and putting back a few drinks. A few becomes a few too many. As the evening comes to an end, people start to head out. You think of calling for a ride. Nah, you live nearby. You can make it home okay. No big deal. What are the odds you get pulled over anyway? And even so, what's the worst that could happen? Your insurance goes up, you lose your license, you lose your job, you total your car, you kill someone. Everyone knows about the risks of driving drunk. The results are tragic and often deadly. However, that doesn't stop everyone from getting behind the wheel while under the influence. That's why police officers are out there right now looking for impaired drivers on our roads to save lives. So if you think you're going to be okay to drive after a few drinks, think again. Play it safe and plan ahead to get a ride. It only takes one mistake to change your life or someone else's forever. Drive sober or get pulled over.